Okay, so this was posted by Frickle Frack Rock. Man, if he'd gone Frickle Fraggle Rock, that way he was so close to brilliance with that name. Factions, living worlds. Hey all, how do you manage factions and keeping a world feel alive / existing outside the players in your game? I run a sandboxy game that has lots of elements that I leave up to chance and random generation. I'm looking for an easy way to keep the world around the players fluid and existing in its own right. I would ideally be looking for something with some level of random generation, leaving it up to dice and context to drive things forward. I own a copy of Worlds Without Numbers, and while I use it for some world building, I find the faction stuff a little too complicated for practical use for my case. Of course, I have different layers of factions, people the players interact with, as well as general world events the characters don't have sway over, but that I also would like to abstract from myself and not have to dictate the course of events or the rate at which they unfold, if that makes sense. I have some elements of a faction system in place, which involve a question and answer system and utilizes clock mechanics from Blade in the Dark to a certain degree, but that's for more player adjacent stuff. Anyway, I hope this question makes sense. Feel free to ask for clarification. Okay, so I don't think I have a single one particular thing for factions. I mean, there is just tracking involved. Yeah, you could use sheets, tabs, tables in an Excel chart to figure out where your factions are. You can assign dice to things. So one thing that you can do is if you have, let's say, short-term or you could say easily attainable goals, longer term or medium attainable goals, maybe long-term, small, unlikely attainable goals, or at least without repeated effort, and then maybe even some kind of overwhelming goal that's on its own is very unlikely to be attainable, at least not without a bunch of other stuff hitting first. And then you could assign those essentially dice. So let's say at the top end, you've got a D100, then maybe you go to a D20, then you go to a D12, then you go to a D8, D6 down the line. And on different intervals of time, and you could spread those out. So maybe for those on the D4, which might be, hey, these are the ones that they're really likely to get, and they're very close to getting, and it's very well within their reach to get. It's a D4, and you can roll it, say, weekly. And if you hit a 4, they've achieved that part of their goal, and you can have thought about what are the consequences of achieving that goal, and then everything else can move down a step. So to put in an example, let's say at the top end you have summoning Orcus, and then at the very bottom you have finding a base of operations. Maybe you have above that gain the influence of a local lord, and above that, I'm not sure what I would find, certain artifacts. Above that, find the evil book of Orcus, and then finally, maybe right after that, let's just say for this example, summon Orcus, make a portal for Orcus to enter the world. As they're fulfilling these things, you start off with Orcus being a D100, so you would have to roll a 100, and you would maybe only roll this thing once every 6 months, once a year, whatever. It might be a large time span. So you wouldn't even roll it for a while, right? But as they are accomplishing those other goals, you can see here we've created almost a tree. If they complete the first few goals, suddenly the D100 is dropped down to a D20. And now you have a 5% chance every month, let's say, of doing it. Now it's much more attainable. Then you get down to, if they achieve a few more things, that's much more likely that in the very near future, they're going to do this. And of course, what the players do, what the party does, can obviously interrupt these plans, and you might have to insert new ones. So you have your one plan, which is, hey, if everything goes fine for this cult, nobody stops anything, nobody imposes any other obstacles in their way, then yeah, they're just going to get the straight line. And after at a certain point, boom, 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 they're going to get, okay, summon Orcus, and eventually they'll roll what they need to, and boom, it's done. But the party, of course, is doing stuff. They need to get certain artifacts, but the party got there first. So now they have to try to research some other artifacts or research something else. And then that bumps everything back up. Maybe the party has done something else, deposed the local lord that they got influenced, and now they got to find somebody else, and that bumps everything back up again. So you can have this kind of ebb and flow of how their goals are doing. But I haven't found a system that I would say is just like, wow, this just puts everything in there. You kind of got to find one. Well, we will look in the comments. Maybe the comments here, there'll be some amazing system. I haven't found it yet, but that kind of stuff works for me. To me, it's all about just organizing it in a way and assigning whatever mechanic you want to adjudicating things so that it makes sense. Let's see. Terrence says, I'm supposed to post our links all over, but I get lazy. Yeah, I get lazy. I get lazy too. No Fun Allowed says, I love incrementing dice, which is why I love Dungeon Crawl Classics. They do D3, D4, D5, D6, D7, D8, D10, D12, D14, D16, D20, D24, and D30. Yeah, that's a lot of increment. I have a DCC. I guess I must have a D30 because I think I do have a set of DCC dice that I got at some point. Yeah. And, or, you don't have to use incrementing dice if you want to use something else. It's just, whatever you're comfortable with. And of course, given that you can use electronic die rollers that have no limit to the amount of however you want to engineer your dice. If you want to have 144, 1 in 144 instead of 1 in 100, if you want to have a D27, you can do that, right? So it really is up to finding when you're comfortable with it. Let's dig into these comments and see if any of these are helpful to us. Emerance, is that Lawful Neutral 23, who's got the highest rated comment. Let's see, he shares a link to a generator. It comes up with a faction and details, at the very least, a good place to start. We could take a look at that just as a quick aside, since this is on the Chaotic Shiny website. So this one, let's just see this one that they made. The generated faction called the Icy Sigil. It's a faction of assassins. Their motivation is glory. Their influence below average. Their reputation is awful. They're somewhat old. They're, I guess, the individual leadership. I guess that means they don't have maybe they don't have one overall leader, but they're mostly, I'm not sure what that would mean because it is a faction. So I imagine they must have some organization, but maybe it's, I don't know. I'm not sure what that means. It is a small faction, but it is very stable. They don't have a lot of enemies. They have no allies. Or they don't have a lot of enemies, but they do have a few, which are some nobles and some merchants, but they have almost unlimited resources, and they go into that. That's kind of cool. Current leadership chosen by the previous leader. Okay. I mean, this is kind of nice stuff. I will throw this in the chat also. This is the Chaotic Shiny Action Generator. That's cool. I mean, you can always take the stuff and rip out the things you like, right? You write the stuff that doesn't work for you. Okay, back here. Let's see. V Donut said, the one time someone complimented me of, quote, feeling like the game was alive outside of players' adventures, unquote, was when I finally abandoned random generation of things, decided to just check things out. Like, establish some factions or events that may come up. Then make boxes next to them with their drives, influences, and stuff. From time to time, just take a look at your paper and think, what would have happened? Example, I had my players in a city doing chores for town militia, investigating intrigues of chaos cult. I wanted to spice things up, so I said there was local tension of 3 main religions. The missions could influence some decisions, but barely. And then I guess it's got, let's see. I'll skip, well, let's see, Stag God. Then he's got some, are those supposed to be the check boxes? Infiltrated by cult, conspiring against local duke, discrediting new god, absorbing wild god. Then you have the new god, anti-stag god outcry, divine intervention, full power inquisition. And then the oldest god, last effort, domestic revolution, setting their own militia. Okay, so I guess maybe these are the options that each one of them had. In the end, I decided the stags were fully infiltrated, discredited new godders, which in turn organized outcry and even summoned pitchforks and torches. I remember while players were hiding for 3 days in some tavern basement, when they went out, there was almost all-out war between religious groups that had nothing to do with their missions. Oldest priest didn't even do anything in the end, yet it created this feeling of independency. It doesn't have to be a lot of factions. Maybe a general feel of the place, somewhere where tensions come from. And there don't have to be much of a goal they have to achieve. Sometimes just discovery of rich iron deposits, lowering price of tools will be enough to hint the world is moving out there. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with this approach. I think obviously if you feel like there's something that should happen with these factions you've set up, then you should just make it happen, right? You don't have to randomly do it if you feel like there's a good chance that over this amount of time with this amount of resources they have that they should have accomplished this, that, or the other. I just like the randomness because I like to be kind of surprised by the results as much as the party does. And sometimes you get some interesting things where the thing you thought was the most likely to happen doesn't in fact happen. And something else somewhere else that had very little chance of succeeding happens. And I like those kinds of serendipitous things. And they don't tend to be the ones that are going to come up in my brain. But of course, as always, they should feel to the players that it's all happening in the context, right? It shouldn't come out of nowhere, like something crazy just dropped from the sky. It should feel like, wow, this was an interesting turn of events. I wonder what things behind the scenes created the conditions for which this thing happens. Let's see, Sectorious. This will maybe be the last one that I read out of this one. How I've run factions in simple ways in the past. 1, flesh out the faction a bit, thinking about their assets and goals. Name 3 to 4 important NPCs in that faction. Assigning some actual faces and personalities makes them far less abstract. It becomes less the Galathian legions have invaded Endstone and more General Atticus of Galath and his Blue Legion have invaded Endstone. Make a D8 table of potential developments, actions, or behaviors for each faction. These would probably tie into their general goal, or they might be something like internal struggles or events that keep them from moving as they want to. An 8 die roll indicates a general faction event. Make a D6 table of general faction events, stuff like leadership changes, defections, general problems all factions need to deal with. Roll once or twice, depending on your preference, each month for each faction. Interpret results and implement, rewrite tables and goals as needed. That's the quick and dirty of it. Yeah, I like that. Another thing I would say that doesn't often get brought up when you think about factions in the real world, they're not just takers. In other words, a lot of times in fantasy, you think about, well, these guys, this faction, the Thieves Guild, right? So they thieve. And I suppose if you need something stolen, maybe, I don't know how they're supposed to work with other factions, but basically they're thief. And if you're thieving, they want to cut. But what do they provide to people? When you think about organized crime, they provide services to people. They provide things which are illicit, whether it's drugs or it's alcohol or it's gambling or it's sex trade or it's something else or it is violence, right? They provide that. So even though their goals, and of course the mafiosos, their goals are essentially just to get rich and stay in control. So it makes sense they give and take. But I would even say if you had a cult, like the cult of Summon Orcus, they have to support their operations, right? We think about, well, they're going to do all this stuff leading to Orcus getting summoned. They have to be able to support themselves that whole time. They have to be able to spend money on resources. They have to feed their members. They have to potentially bribe officials to make things pass. They can't just go and kill everybody for everything they need. They might need to buy a manuscript or a book or an artifact. Maybe that the person who currently owns it doesn't know its true value, but maybe they need to buy it. They might need to buy resonances. They might need to do all kinds of things that require money. And then you have to think about, well, where are they getting the money from? They could have a very rich benefactor that might cover part of it. Maybe they do something. Maybe they are good assassins in their own right. And so essentially they function as an assassin's guild. Maybe their clerics create potions of some kind or poisons of some kind. That could also be something. But it's an interesting way to think about that part of the web, because I think it often gets forgotten. We just think about these factions kind of doing what they do and not thinking about, well, how do they support themselves? Because maybe the Thieves Guild, you could say, well, they're just constantly thieving, so they're kind of generating their own income. Sure, maybe that works for them, but it doesn't work for a lot of other guilds that are more esoteric or their goals aren't commercial, like we might think of as the mafia. So it might be interesting to think of is, how do they make their money? How are they getting communities to be okay with them? Sure, in some places they may just be able to threaten folks, but that can't be the only thing. And if we look at in the kind of the real way things work is they generally have some kind of input into the economy. They maybe provide a service that other people won't, or they have some other way that they're involved. But it might be an interesting way to not only give them, it makes them a little more three-dimensional. It also gives the party different ways to interact with them. When you think about the kind of tropes you find in narratives in which the party has to infiltrate the gang, maybe they pretend that they're going to buy potions. Maybe they're pretending they need to hawk their grandmother's jewelry, and it's one of those artifacts, whatever. Like, it opens up a lot of more avenues for the players to interact with this faction if the faction has linkages into the society. Other than that, they're just lurking below some ruin trying to summon a demon. Terrorists sell opium, hack into networks, and steal and ransom and support themselves. Do they provide a service? I would say that the opium is a service. People like drugs. I would say don't take opium, but opium is a drug. Hacking networks, I think when we look at what a lot of these groups are doing, you think about their sponsors. I think a lot of these groups aren't just doing it. If you think about some groups position themselves as sort of nations of their own right there, or like ISIS, I guess you would say, or ISIL, whatever, would saying that they're a nation, they might be operating out of their own maybe their own strategic goals, but a lot of other things will be working for sponsor nations. When you talk about, say, in the United States, if you're in the United States, you hear about terrorists that the government would link to Iran or China or these other groups, right? And they are essentially saying that they're doing some things for hire, that China is using these groups as fronts to conduct these attacks. Presumably, maybe they get weapons from China or money from China or whatever. And I'm sure the U.S. has probably done, the U.S. has done tons of dirt on its own. So I'm not trying to split hairs about which great powers are doing dirt, because they're all doing dirt. But I think you can really look at a lot of things and say, yeah, they have some kind of linkages. Doesn't mean that they're not just doing stuff on their own. Doesn't mean they're not just thieving, but there often is multiple things that are going on. And when you have those things, when you're kind of creating these webs, not only does it, again, give them more of a three-dimensionality, maybe the cult has to mind what somebody outside the cult tells them because they need that person, need their resources, but it gives different ways for the party to interact. If they want to hurt the cult that's trying to summon orcas, and that cult is growing opium somewhere to sell to finance their efforts, then those opium fields are a pathway for the party to strike at that group indirectly. Take out the opium fields, cut off their supply, that cut off their supply of funds. That really damages them. So I think there's something there. Again, it's something you can play with. It definitely gets more complicated the more you drill in there, but it's something that you might be able to integrate, and it could be something that adds to your faction play in your game. All right, I think that's all I've got for this one.